Today we're going to be looking at how we can use n8n workflows to create and host a dashboard web page. What you're looking at here is a data-driven dashboard web page. The data is coming from Microsoft Wide World Importer's sample database. We can see that we have three charts. The first chart represents customer transactions from January to May of 2016 in terms of sales dollars. The second chart represents supplier transactions, or purchases from suppliers, by percentages compared to the total sum of suppliers. We have what is known as a force-directed chart for our stock locations, and our stock items are organized by inventory and bin. So the total amount of inventory items in each bin, which represents a section of the warehouse, will be displayed, and the surface area that the circles occupy is representative of the amount of inventory items compared to other locations. So for this demonstration, as I mentioned, we're going to be using n8n. We're going to be briefly touching upon and using Amcharts JavaScript library. We're going to be using standard HTML and CSS. We're also going to be using Claude to assist us with certain parts of the application, certain aspects such as the JavaScript and the SQL that we're going to be writing to drive this website. So let's go ahead and take a look at what our finished workflow will look like. So this is composed of several different types of nodes. The first thing that we're going to be using that is going to essentially serve as our web host is a webhook, and this webhook is really a listener. It gives you a URL. You can declare some methods in here, whether it's a get or a post, but it gives you a URL where you can actually respond to browsers making requests. We're going to be using several different Microsoft SQL queries here. We've got one for the customer's transaction, stock location, supplier transactions. That represents the charts that we just looked at. We're also going to use a read file operation so that we can get our background image for our dashboard, as you can see here. Then we're just going to be doing some normal workflow merges, aggregates, so that we can construct an HTML template, which serves as our dashboard. And then we have a respond to webhook node. And that respond to webhook node is going to be where the actual response is set after this workflow steps are complete. We will be using Amcharts. Amcharts supplies ample examples here. This makes it very easy to get charts up and running with your data without necessarily having to know the syntax, because they supply code pens where the JavaScript can be massaged to look like the shape of your data and serve the purposes that you need. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a blank workflow just so that we can go through the process here. Okay, and when I start working with a new workflow in n8n, I typically like to use a manual trigger. That way I don't have to execute a webhook and hit a URL so that I can test it. So let's go ahead and do that. We also know that we're going to be using 3 SQL Server Nodes. So I'm going to leave these empty as is so that I can duplicate them. And I'm going to duplicate them again. All right. What I want to do is I want to rename these so that we have some context to what they actually are. So we will call this customer transactions. Call this supplier transactions. And we will call this one stock locations. So let's look at our first transaction here. I already have a credential saved in n8n credentials repository. So we're going to be using that one. This is, as mentioned, Wide World Importers. I'm going to go ahead and put our transactions query in here, where we're selecting the year and month, some of the transaction amount, and we're looking at, in this particular database, the latest year was 2016, so we're going to be looking at that. I'm going to go ahead and execute this step. As you can see here, I'm getting my records with my total transaction amounts. So, one thing that I wanted to go over is how to create your SQL queries using Claude. If you are not too familiar with SQL, this is a tip that I use. Sometimes it's nice because it just formats things the way that you want, and ultimately you end up with a better design. So let's first take a look at our database. The Wide World Importers we're actually going to be using as the base for our customer transactions view, the view customer transactions view. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select from here. As you can see, I have customer transactions in here. If I want to quickly generate a query using Claude, I can take an image of this and paste this in Claude. Now I can specify the type of query I want. So what we're looking for in this customer transaction view is customer transactions for the months that are available to us. I believe it's January through April or May of 2016. That was the last or the most recent dates that they have in the sample database. So I'm going to go ahead and have Claude generate our query for us. Okay, so what I'm asking it as a prompt here is, given a following SQL Server table, I want a query that will show the sum of customer transactions where the transaction amount is greater than 0, grouped by the month of the transaction where the year is 2016. So we'll go ahead and let Claude generate our query for us. Should look something similar to what I had in the first example. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and copy that. We're going to take a look at that. That looks about like what I want. So we're going to use this as the SQL in our first transaction. So we're going to head back to our dashboard, our designer. We're going to open this. It's probably close to the same thing, maybe format a little bit differently. Yep, we have some different columns, but that will work for us. Okay, so we're going to do something similar with the supplier transactions. This query is going to be a little bit more complicated, but not much. We're also going to have Claude generate that. So let's go ahead and take a look at our supplier transactions. I believe it's going to be in our tables this time. Here we go, purchasing supplier transactions. So, as you can see, I have a supplier ID, transaction amount, and it looks like we have some dates in here. So I, again, am going to take a screenshot of this table. So the prompt is, given an SQL Server query, I want a query that will select the total transaction amount where the amount is greater than 0, grouped by supplier ID. So we are going to take a look at this query. Okay, so we have this for our dashboard. However, we are going to want to supply a little bit more information. So we have the supplier ID key here, but we want the supplier ID name. So that is just going to be a matter of asking Claude to update our query. So I'm going to select from purchasing suppliers where we have the ID and supplier name. I am going to take a screenshot of this. Paste this into Claude. Okay, so my prompt is I'd like to use the supplier name from the supplier's table instead of the ID in the previous supplier's query. So this should do a join for us. We're going to copy that. We're going to take a look at it. Okay, that's what I wanted. Let's go ahead and take this query. In fact, I don't even need the supplier ID, so I'm going to get rid of that. Perfect. And I'm going to go to my second query. I'm going to open this, paste that in there, execute it. We have the supplier name, total transaction amount. That looks good. So that's the second query that we're going to be using to drive the supplier transactions chart. Alrighty. Now the last one we have here is the stock locations, and what that looks like is stock item holdings, I believe. Yes. Okay. So we have stock items with the location, bin location. So this would be like a warehouse, and there'd be a bin location in there, and they have the stock quantity, and we have a date when it was last edited. So in order to do this, we're going to look at, I'm probably going to narrow this down to 2016 as the year. So I'm going to take a screenshot of this. We're going to paste this into Claude. And the column name on this would be quantity on hand. Sometimes it's good to Okay, so given the following SQL query, I want to sum the quantity on hand grouped by the bin location, where the last edited date has year 2016. Okay, let's take a look at this, see what this yields. All right, that looks good. That's about what we wanted, so we're going to paste this into our third query. Execute that. There we go. We see we have the columns that we need. So what I'm going to do is because I'm going to be aggregating and merging, I'm going to go ahead and connect these nodes. As I mentioned earlier, I like to use the manual execution trigger as a starting point when I'm designing my workflows. That way I can execute a workflow without having to hit a URL, and I can see exactly what's going on. I click on each one of these, I can see the data that came out from the previous the most recent request, and we have all of our data here. If you look at our execution closer, you can see that after each execution, it lists the amount of items that are returned as a result of that execution. And of course, the way that n8n works in its default setup is that for each one of these items, the next nodes in the pipeline will run. So we don't want that. We actually want what we're aiming for is to get the JSON from our query. So we're going to use aggregates that essentially just take all the items that are in each one of these nodes output and aggregate them into one JSON document. So I'm going to have to add an aggregate, and we will duplicate that because we're going to need it several times. And we will give these contextual meaning by renaming them. Okay, so we're going to connect our nodes. The way we're going to set these up, that instead of aggregating individual fields by one of our field names, we're going to select all item data into a single list. And we're going to give these context by giving them contextual names. So we're going to say customer transactions will be the name of our JSON object. And if I execute this, you will see that indeed I get a JSON object with an array named customer transactions, which has all of our transactions, and the output is going to be one item now. So anything that happens after this particular node in this workflow along this path will only be executed one time because we have one item, and that correlates with obviously the amount of times that it's going to run. So we're going to do something similar to all three of these. So for this one, all item into a single list, and we're going to call this supplier transactions. And we can see that we have the expected output. Okay, last one, stock locations. Same thing. We'll be naming this stock locations. Okay. Go ahead and save my workflow. So now we've got a branch. They are going to run our SQL queries and are going to aggregate each of the view data into a single item. So if I execute the workflow, we will see that we have, as expected, one item, one item, one item. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to merge our streams so that we have basically, it will wait for each one of the streams to complete before it starts outputting data. So if we've said that we were going from, say, an asynchronous operation, we are going to wait for all of these operations to complete, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a merge. We can specify the inputs. In this case, we're going to have 3. We're going to use the default append mode. And we're going to connect one of our inputs, all of our inputs here, to this node. As we can see, we will get 3 items at the end of this, one that represents each one of our branches that we have. We have our customer transactions, our supplier transactions, and our stock locations. Because we still have 3 items, we're going to use an additional aggregate, and this is going to give us a single JSON object that has 3 arrays in it, and each one of those are going to represent what we saw in our merge for the different types of transactions. So let me go ahead and do that. And the purpose of this is to get 3 items to 1 item, because we're going to want to return a single HTML response, not 3. So ultimately, we need to be dealing with a single object when we generate that template. So we are going to select all item data into a single list in our aggregate. And we will execute that. So we see that we have data and we have our collections. We have 3 arrays in here. So the first index array is going to be our customer transactions. The second index in the array is going to be the supplier transactions. And the third index is going to be our stock locations. But as you can see, now we have 1 item. So this is going to facilitate generating our HTML template with all of the data at one time instead of waiting for multiple branch executions. Okay, so let's take a moment here to execute the entire workflow, and we can see the output. Everything is working as expected. So now it's time to generate our HTML template. As I mentioned, we are going to be working with Amcharts. So in order to get the HTML template up and running, we're going to do this in stages. I also mentioned that Amcharts has very good examples so that we can use our data and we can actually manipulate their examples to use our data. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is to create an HTML template. So we're going to select generate an HTML template. We're going to add that to our node. It gives us some example HTML here. So we're going to go ahead and save our workflow. We're going to connect this to our aggregate output. And we're going to head on over to the Amcharts documentation. So first thing that we're going to replicate here is our customer transactions, which is an XY chart. So we are going to go to XY chart. And Amcharts provides ample amount of documentation about how to get set up, including the CDN paths for the libraries that you'll be using, how to create your chart instance. What I find here that is the most useful is to actually scroll to the point where they are giving you a CodePen example that you can edit. So if we look at this, we are going to find the first one here, the anatomy of an XY chart, and we are going to use their example to edit on CodePen. So they have this nicely broken down into the HTML for us, along with the CSS and the JavaScript. So, given that we are creating an HTML template, we're going to go ahead and do that. We will leave our HTML, our head, and our body. We are going to replace that. At the end of our body, we are going to place the JavaScript from the CDN to comply with our best practices. So let's go ahead and reorder this. We're going to copy this, and it doesn't really matter. This is a performance, I guess, a best practice. I'm just going to go ahead and copy their example verbatim and use it. So in our container here, we are going to replace that with our scripts. So this is what we need. We've got a div here for the chart div. Also, there is some styling. So in order to do that, I'm going to create inline, HTML inline style in our page. And I'm simply going to copy the CSS and paste that into our style. Okay, so now that we have this, we have their JavaScript. That's the portion where we're actually going to see the output. Now, they supply the some of the test data and the sample data for us. So what I actually want to do at this point is to just copy and paste exactly what they have in here, just so that we can get an idea of what our HTML template is going to look like. So, oh, looks like they already provided a style here, so let me go ahead and consolidate that. Actually, I can remove that because this is the default style. We already have a script tag, so I'm going to copy the script in here. And inside of our script tag, I'm going to paste that. And let us execute the step now. Now we'll see that we're not getting output here because our HTML is utilizing JavaScript. So that's not going to be of much use to us. So we are going to go ahead and take a look at this output. And we can see that it's exactly the same output that we were expecting. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and we want to save. We're going to go ahead and we're going to respond to our webhook. One thing that you'll notice here is that I have a little pin symbol here. And anytime you edit in order to see your HTML, you're going to get pinned data. And that's how you're allowed to debug. So in other words, every time this execution workflow runs, it will use this mocked/pinned data in order to send output to the next node. We don't want that. So I'm going to uncheck that. I'm going to go ahead and save that. So at this point, we're going to need to do a few things. First of all, we are ready to set this execute manual trigger to a webhook. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And we are also ready to add the respond to webhook node. And this will be the response that we send back to the browser. Okay. Let's go ahead and add our webhook node. Leave the defaults in place. I'm going to remove the connections now between our manual execution trigger, and we're going to replace them with the webhook. Sometimes I leave this handy in case I want to reconnect and test one of these particular branches of workflow. That way I don't have to wait for the webhook. But the way that we get this to execute is that it gives us initially a test URL, and then when we activate the workflow, it goes to a production URL. So we can click on the URL here and we can copy it. Let's go ahead and hit that URL. The first thing was we have to listen for a test event. We have to do this every time that we want to initiate a run of our workflow. So we get what we expected. We have a respond to webhook node found. That was our last output. So it's complaining that on our designer, we have a respond to webhook, but there are a couple things that we have to do here to make this work correctly. First of all, we have these response types, behaviors, and we can respond immediately. So that basically is something where you have a webhook and it's going to respond to the first node, which would be the webhook node. So you would actually have your response in this request, but we don't want to do that. We have a few options in here. We're going to be using respond to webhook, and that is a response defined in that node. So we are going to be sending our HTML to this node, and that's what we want to respond with. We also want a workflow to run. Since we're going to be sending back HTML to the request, we need to add our content type header. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We're going to add a response header, content type, and we're going to be sending a response of text HTML. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. we can execute from our workflow node. We need to grab that URL again. So I'm going to copy that. It's going to be the same URL, so you can leave a browser window open. Okay, so we have HTML and we have a bunch of new lines in there. So at least we know that our webhook document is responding and hitting our response node. So let's go back and complete the following steps that are going to be necessary to get this to actually respond with HTML that we're expecting. We're going to configure our respond to webhook so that it responds to the GET request with an HTML file. A couple of things we need to change in here. We're looking at the defaults here. It has a respond with first incoming item, and while this might work for JSON, it's not going to work for HTML content. So we're going to drop down here, and we're actually going to choose text. We're going to respond with a simple text message. We have an option for HTML in here, but our response is going to be a text HTML type, so this is going to work for us. We're going to go ahead and take the HTML that was generated. We're going to paste that in the response body. We're also going to add a response code of 200, which is the HTTP response code for OK. So if we execute this, we'll see that we do have some HTML here. It doesn't make much sense to us right now, so let's go ahead and save our workflow. And we're going to click Execute Workflow. Go back and take a look at our HTML document. As you can see, we now have the sample data that looks like the example of the Amcharts XY chart. Okay, now we're going to actually manipulate the data so that the data is based on our data, which in this case we're going to be using this XY chart for our customer transaction data. So we can use Claude to do this for us. So if we take our HTML template, for instance, and we just copy the entire HTML in here, and we give this to Claude, we're going to start a new chat. I suppose I'll just continue with this. So I'm going to give it a prompt. Paste in there. And I'm going to reach back over to my workflow, and I'm going to grab my customer query JSON. And what we can do is just feed this to Claude. Okay, so my prompt, if we can see it. Okay, given the following HTML, I'm going to go ahead and run this so we can take a look at this easier. Given the following HTML and JavaScript Amcharts JS sample, use the code in the sample. And I've got all my code. But instead, I want the chart to be configured to run with the following chart data. Alrighty, so we have a full HTML page. It preserves our styling and it preserves our I'm hoping it yes, it preserved our script references. So we're going to go and we are going to put that into a response for our HTML template. Just going to copy and paste, save, execute our workflow. Let's see how Claude did. Hey, look at that. So we have our transaction amount, January, February, March, April, May. So that looks good. Okay, so this is a dashboard, and we are going to have more than one chart on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this node. And we are going to connect this duplicated node where we are going to put the pie chart. And that pie chart is going to be our supplier transactions. So we're going to do something very similar. With this HTML, we're going to go to Amcharts and we're going to look at a pie chart example. We're going to scroll to the point where we first see the code pen, and we will edit on code pen. The HTML looks very much the same, so we're going to copy this portion of the HTML into our template. We can see that our template already has the style. It already has the, because we did a copy from our previous template, it has all the references for the scripts. It has a chart div just like our other one. It has a similar style. So the only thing that we really need to change is the actual JavaScript code. So again, we're going to copy the sample that is provided into our script section. So we're just going to eliminate our existing script. Okay, and we are going to go back to our canvas. We're going to save that. We're going to execute the workflow. And we see now our pie chart. Okay, so what we want to do with this pie chart is to make it work with our data. Again, we will just copy the HTML. We'll ask Claude to do something similar. We will say, given the following Amcharts sample pie chart, recreate the HTML. So it uses the data provided. Give it a little bit more context in the first. We're going to paste the HTML. Then we're going to grab our suppliers JSON. Back to Claude. Alrighty, let's go ahead and paste that into our template. We're going to do the entire thing. Save, execute our workflow. Take a look at it. There we go. So this is looking a little bit better. What we do see here, however, is that some of these suppliers have such a low amount or no amount that they don't even show up. We're going to call that fine for now. This is a demonstration, so we're not going to worry about that too much. The structure of our pie chart looks correct. Yeah, so we have two companies here really that are the majority. We have a Fabrican Incorporated, and we also have Litware. So that is why our pie chart looks kind of two-dimensional. That is okay. There are some additional things that you can do. For instance, if we look at our dashboard, I have a kind of a donut shape here, so we can add something in here. It looks like we'll just copy this JavaScript, and we'll see. We just paste this in here, somewhere down here. They're using the same variable names. So let's go ahead and save this, see if we get a donut. Doesn't look like we get a donut. Perhaps I need to, okay, so that's the inner radius. That makes more sense. On that mode, I just gave it the stroke and the weight. So we're going to go ahead and add our inner radius here. Execute our workflow. Now we should see a donut. Okay, so that is looking good. Okay, so now we are going to be moving right along to our force-directed chart. We'll go ahead and duplicate once again our node for the HTML generation. We will delete the existing connections. We will connect this node up. We'll head on over to Amcharts so that we can review the documentation for the force-directed tree. This force-directed tree is our stock locations. We get bigger circles with the more stock items, so it might be useful for warehousing to see where the majority of your items or where the spacing is of your stock items. That's not important for the demo. We'll just assume that it's important for the people who are looking at it. Okay, so we have our HTML node that we copied right here. HTML2 will respond to webhook. Let's take a look at this. Again, we're going to go to the full sample, the first code pin that we find. This one gets a little bit more complicated because they create networked nodes, which we're not going to be doing, but we can still use the sample. Okay, so we do have additional script here that was not included in our previous two examples. So we will go ahead and add that in here. It's not uncommon for different types of charts to have their own JavaScript CDN. So let me try that again. All right, that looks good. Everything is lining up here. Let's go back to our force directed. I'm going to close this out. Our style looks the same, so what we will do is copy the JavaScript. As you can see, they have a very large item here, series data, because they have these child items in networked nodes. But we'll go ahead and copy that and paste that into our JavaScript for a test run. So we're going to remove the existing script here. And we are going to save and execute our workflow. We should now see a very interesting force-directed chart. There we go. So that looks good. All right, in order to make that work with our data, we're going to do the same thing as the previous two nodes. We will copy our template. We will go back to Claude. Okay, we'll see if it is smart enough to figure out that we're not using networked nodes. So let's go back and get our stock locations item. This is a little bit bigger. I'm not completely concerned with that at this point because we are going to be replacing that with actual variables. We're doing this just to get everything in an order. So I'm going to go ahead and copy. There's the ability to copy the output data. So it makes a lot more sense to do that. I'm going to tell it this is the JSON, paste the JSON. Going to let Claude do its work. Yeah, it looks like it's trying to do something fancy here. Let's see. Looks like it's actually trying to do something with the networked nodes. We can modify that as needed. So let's go back and modify our HTML and look at the surprise that we get. Save our workflow. We're going to execute the workflow. We're going to come to our URL. We're going to see how it did. Okay, so that's interesting. It put zones in for us. You know, I'm actually going to leave that. That was pretty clever because we have these bin numbers and we have the units, and Claude was smart enough to create zones for us, and that is actually quite helpful. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to use that, and that's going to differ from our much more boring stock locations from our original dashboard. So we're going to go ahead and keep this. This looks good. Pleasantly surprised. Okay, we have hard-coded data. That's not going to do us any good. We're going to need to use the variables generated because we want real-time data from our SQL queries. So we're going to do that again with each individual chart. You'll see where I'm going with this in a moment. So I'm going to look at the output from the aggregate transactions. We can look at the JSON. This is the customer transactions. So we actually need to replace in our HTML template the chart data with the result from our customer transaction. So looking at our chart data, we are able to use the data from our customer transactions, which I'm going to drop right in here. And it's going to go ahead and it's going to put these brackets in here. And you'll see that the instruction here is that these character symbols, if you enclose it in these braces, that it is interpolated JavaScript. So let's go ahead and execute this step and see the HTML that it generates for us. Again, we're going to have to click on our edit output. We're interested in our chart data. So this is one of the caveats you'll see. In fact, that's what our chart data looks like when it's string interpolated and it's getting injected into our HTML template. So there's one more step that we need to do in order to get this to look correctly. We simply have to add the toJSON string helper method to the customer transactions. Now when we execute this, we will see that we have, in fact, the data that we expect from our chart data. So this looks good. I'm going to make sure that I cancel this because I don't want to pin the output to this particular node because I want to look at it. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. We've connected our HTML, the first template, to our webhook response. So if we look at this now, we should see the customer transactions with live data. And in fact, we do. So this is no longer hard-coded. This is being transformed from the query, aggregated, merged, and the variable is being injected into the HTML template, so that looks good. I'm going to go ahead and do that for our pie chart with the supplier transactions. So one thing that I can do here to make this easy on myself is to copy the expression that we know works. We're going to have to change the name in our template. So we have to look at our chart data here. We are going to remove this chart data. We are going to make this chart data not our customer transactions, but it's going to be our supplier transactions. You can just as easily drag that from here onto the designer or onto the HTML template text area. So supplier transactions, that should be good. I'm going to go ahead and execute that. Okay, so it says it is undefined. And the reason it's undefined is because, in fact, this data is an array. The first object is customer transactions. The second is supplier transactions, so I have to apply the correct indexing on that. So instead of JSON data 0, it's going to be JSON data 1. As mentioned, probably would have been better if I did it this way for purposes of demonstration. That way I would have the right property, and I'm going to go ahead and put to JSON string, which we're going to need to do for these, each one of them. So if I execute that, again, I'm going to look at this. I need to go back where the data looks. So I got the supplier name, the amounts, everything looks correct. Again, I'm sure to cancel it because I don't want to pin that data to the response. And we will go back. We will save, execute our workflow. Now we should see our donut. All right, so that looks good. That's about what we expect to see. So we are good on that one. And you might have guessed we're going to do that to our force-directed chart. So this time, I'm going to use the data at, if you look at the schema, you can see more clearly what each data field contains. So this one we're actually using it's not chart data, but it's going to be series data. So we have this stock data that's being declared up here, and I'm just going to get rid of that. Now it looks like it's doing some grouping for us. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that because we want essentially the same output. So the only thing I'm going to replace here is the stock data array. And I'm going to let the Claude generated grouping data remain as is. So our stock data is actually going to be in our stock locations query. Again, to JSON string. Let's take a look at what we have here. Okay, we have the stock data that we expect. Make sure to save that. Let's go ahead and execute our workflow and see what we get as far as our force-directed chart is concerned. That looks good. That is what we want. Okay. So we have 3 different HTML templates here, but we want one because we're making a dashboard. So the only thing that we need to do is consolidate both our naming and our scripts. So I am going to go ahead and this is something that we could have Claude do. However, I find just replacing names in the script, we can even have Claude do that for our variables, because right now we have several chart variables, but we're going to have 3 charts. So we're going to use Claude to assist us in generating the HTML. So I'm going to copy each one of these templates. And I'm going to open up Claude, give it a prompt. first page, paste the HTML in here. So I have 3 HTML files, each representing a different chart. I want to merge these files in one HTML file with HTML styles and scripts in their respective locations. You will need to avoid collisions with variable naming. The first page chart we will call customer transactions. Hopefully it will use this to decide how to name our divs and our variables. So we will go ahead and copy that. Back to Claude. Third chart on the page should be named stock locations. Let's go back. And let her rip. Let's see what it's going to do here. So we've got some, it's giving us all of our scripts. Here we go. That looks good, doesn't it? Customer transactions chart, suppliers transactions chart. Looks like it's doing a good job. Let's go ahead and give it a spin. So this is our first template that we're going to be using. If this works, we can delete the others. Let's go ahead and save. Execute our workflow. Take a look at what we have. Hey, we have supplier transactions. We have stock item locations. So our dashboard is beginning to come together. Let's go ahead and get rid of these additional nodes as we do not need them anymore. So we have a single HTML page, and we have all of our charts, and we have our response, and everything is looking good so far. So what we're going to do now is to make our chart look more attractive. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use some type of a flex layout so that the first 2 charts appear on the same line, 50% each, and the third chart appears 100% underneath the first 2 charts. So we're going to ask Claude to do that. We will take our HTML again. This may not be necessary. The first 2 charts occupying 50% width each. Okay, so given the following HTML, doesn't like that. I would like the first 2 charts to be displayed on the first line occupying 50% width each. The stock items chart, I'd like to be underneath the other charts occupying 100% on its own line. So here we go. Sometimes it'll only give you a snippet of the HTML. I like it when it gives me the whole page, because when I'm working with n8n, that helps a lot. I'd rather just copy all and paste all. Okay, so let's go ahead and copy that and see how that looks. Again, it's important to save at this point. Execute the workflow. We're going to take a look at what it did. So this looks pretty good. I'm going to want to align the headers in the center. So let me ask Claude to do that. This time I will not repaste the HTML. I'm going to say I'd like the headings to be aligned horizontally in the center over each chart. We're going to add that to Claude. And the HTML that was generated for us, we're just going to copy, paste, and we should see that indeed we have center aligned headings. Execute, refresh. Very good. So as you can see, we're getting to a point where our dashboard starts to look more like a dashboard. Let's just say that we want to improve the visual appearance of our dashboard. One of the things that I find quite helpful sometimes is to look at examples of other dashboards and have Claude assist us with some dashboard examples. So let's go ahead and take a look at the soft UI dashboard. We'll give it a live preview. So one of the things I like about this here is the box shadows, right? So I would like to apply that to our dashboard, and I can actually have Claude do that by just grabbing an image. I'm going to grab this particular panel, and I'll just ask Claude, can you place each chart separately in a panel like this? Spelling. With the box shadow. So we'll wait for this to generate. Copy. Paste into our HTML output. Save it. So looking at our dashboard, we can see that it looks a lot nicer with our paneled layout, with our box shadows. If we want to further improve the design of this, we will generate an attractive background that gives it some contrast. So I'm going to do that using Google Gemini. And I'm going to ask it to generate a background that I can use for a HTML dashboard web page. Okay, generate an attractive background image that I can use for an HTML desktop web page. I'm going to go ahead and let it generate this for me. Alright, that doesn't look so bad. I'm not going to be picky, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to download this. Full size. So I went ahead and I downloaded this. I moved this to my documents, YouTube dashboard demo assets folder. The reason why I'm doing this, also I renamed this to background PNG, is because I want to make this background image available on my Docker desktop, or using Docker desktop on my n8n host. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Docker. You can see I've already been doing some work in here, but I'm going to go under, first I'm going to click on Files, then I'm going to go to Share, and in the miscellaneous directory here, I'm going to import our dashboard demo, and I'm going to select this. Now, if you're running n8n locally, you can just as easily reference a drive that n8n has permission to access, or excuse me, a path that n8n has permission to access in order to host your file. If we look at our dashboard demo, we see that we will have a background PNG image. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to copy this path. So what we need to do in order to be able to host our image, first have to read it from disk. So I'm going to add a read-write file from disk node. I'm going to paste full path based on our absolute path of our n8n host here, and I'm going to give this a contextual name. Read background image. Let's go ahead and execute this step. I have to first connect this to a node. Give it to my webhook. If we look at our output here, we will see that we have a file type output. Well, this isn't going to work for us because we need to embed base64 encoded image data into our style sheet in our generated XML in order for it to display correctly. So we're going to have Claude assist us in generating a JavaScript node and give us the code so that we can extract the base64 encoded string data out of our file node. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and supply my image. So this says I have the following node that reads a PNG file from disk. I want to embed the base64 encoded string into my style section in an HTML file. I would like an n8n code node with JavaScript code that will convert this PNG image to a base64 encoded string I can use in a style sheet. So we're going to have this generate the code that we're going to use in a JavaScript node that we're going to be adding to our workflow. Okay, let's go ahead and copy that. We'll add a code node. Paste that in. Execute our step. It's probably waiting for our trigger, so what we want to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to use our manual trigger so that we can get this working correctly. Oh, okay. Well, it's telling me I already have a manual trigger, so let's go ahead and hook this up. Stop it, and we will execute the node, execute workflow, and we will see what we get here. So we do in fact have a base64, a data URI, and a CSS background. After I have the output in base64 encoded string that I desire, I'm going to go ahead and I have to merge this into the workflow branch that generates the HTML, so I have to add another input to my merge. I'm going to go ahead and connect the code to this. I'm going to remove the connection to my manual execution and reconnect this to the webhook node. I want to execute the webhook. I'm going to go ahead and execute this workflow so that I can see what our output looks like after the merge. Okay, so if I look at our aggregate transactions, I'm going to switch this to aggregate transactions and background, because now if we look at what we have here, in addition to our transaction data, we have some additional strings here. This is the one I want. This one is actually going to be added to the CSS. So let's look at the ways that we can do that in our HTML template. I'm going to go ahead and save. So our HTML template, we will now see that we have an additional index data item with the base 64 and the data URI. And this actually gives us the entirety that we need for our CSS background declaration that we're going to put in our body. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to drag this in here. And what we should see is the content of this in our HTML template. So if I execute the step, so we do have a much larger file now, 1.3 megs, and I show data, we can see that we now have our background. So I'm going to go back to Canvas, I'm going to save this, and we are going to execute the workflow from the webhook, refresh, and so now we have our background. To be entirely honest, I like this background better. So that's easy enough to change. I'm going to grab the URL from the initial version, from the start of the video, completed version. I'm going to swap that out for the URL here. Everything else in the workflow should remain the same. So now I should get the background that I desired. So here we are with our dashboard, real-time data. We have our customer transactions, our supplier transactions, item locations, and we can continue to improve visual aspects of this, add additional items, but most of the steps are going to be the same for that. So when we are ready to finalize this, which we are, we're going to give this workflow a name. We're going to call it full dashboard. We're going to set our workflow to active. Some of the newer versions of n8n are going to give you production checklists. We don't care about any of this, so we are going to get rid of that. We have now an active, published workflow, and from this point, we can actually use our production URL instead of our test URL. And when we do that, this URL remains constant. So if you noticed throughout the workflow development, when I would use the test URL, I would actually have to execute the workflow so that it would listen for an event each time that I ran the workflow. When you go to production, or when you mark your workflow in an active state, to be more precise, you'll no longer have to do that. So you'll have, a static URL now that you can use to deploy or to give to your customers. So that about wraps it up. Let me go over the probably just go over exactly what we did again so that we summarize it. We're using webhook nodes. That's you can relate that to like a HTML endpoint on a web server. We are using Microsoft SQL queries. Could simply be Postgre, flat files, anything that you can imagine, as long as it outputs data that we can use and make charts out of. We're reading a background image so that we can apply that to our dashboard to give it more contrast. We are then aggregating the items because we have multiple records in our query return statements, so we aggregate them so that each query returns one item. We're merging all of that together. Essentially what we're trying to do is we're building a JSON document that we can feed into a HTML template. So after we have 4 items merged, we want to convert that to one item, and we're using that to generate the template from our data, and we're using a respond to webhook node. And this correlates with the response type in our webhook so that every one of our workflow items and nodes executes. And finally, the response is set out. Last thing I can do is click on the tidy up. That'll align our workflow nicely. Go ahead and save it. And that concludes our demonstration for how to create dashboards or reports using n8n. Accompanying this video, I'm going to put a link in the description to the GitHub repository. What you will find here is a dev plan that actually walks through the steps that we went through in our video so that you can follow along more closely if you want to implement your own dashboard. I've also included the full dashboard export. This is the download file from the n8n workflow that we used in the demonstration. So in here you can take a closer look at the queries that were used and the JavaScript code as well as the file read operation. This won't work entirely if you import it into your own n8n instance because it does not store the credentials that I use for the SQL Server database. The file paths may be different as well for the background image, but it serves as a general guideline. You'll see every single node and the properties that were set on those nodes, and in coordination with the dev plan, you should be able to follow along. So hopefully this demonstration will spawn some ideas for creating your own dashboards. It's a very quick, effective way. It's easy to maintain. And I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you.